Hello, and thank you for joining us for this bonus episode of Freedom from the Struggle. I'm your host, Anthony Corelli. I wanted to take the time to thank you, patrons, for your support of this program, and I sincerely hope that you're enjoying these bonus episodes. This episode, bonus episode number 4, is about the possession of Dawn Decker. Some of you may know this story, and some of you may not. It's a story that captured my attention several years back, well over a decade. But it's a story that has so much corroborating evidence that it's very hard to deny that something paranormal happened to this young man named Don Decker. If you've heard this story before, you probably consider it fantastical, with the exception of not only the amount of evidence, but the caliber of the witnesses to this story. So sit back and buckle up as we get into the possession of Don Decker. Now, in 1983, in a little town called Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, there was a young man named Don Decker who happened to be incarcerated at the time. And keep in mind that Don said that before this episode, he had not really experienced any paranormal activity at all. Now, at this time, Don was in the Monroe County Jail, and the warden, a gentleman by the name of Dave Keenhold, had decided to let Don out on a weekend furlough for his grandfather's funeral. You see, Don was serving a 1 to 2 year sentence for stolen property. And Don was known in the jail as being very quiet and introverted, somebody who didn't really interact with others, which drew attention to himself. So everybody knew who he was. But of course, everybody also knew that nothing like this had ever happened before. And when he comes back to the jail later on, that'll make some sense. So when Don was released that day for his furlough, his mother had decided to not let him stay there. And you can imagine that there was some family tension. Don was in jail. She wasn't happy with him. And there seems to be a family history of some dysfunction that Don will talk about. And I'll outline that a little later in this podcast. So Don, although he was released on this furlough, he really had nowhere to stay. So a family friend had kind of made the decision that Don could stay with them over the weekend for the funeral. And so Don made his way to the home of Bob Kiefer and his family. Now, I have to say that Don is very adamant that he did not really like his grandfather, but maybe felt the obligation to go to the funeral, and if we're honest, maybe just wanted to get out on the furlough. So he did attend the funeral of his grandfather, who he drastically disliked. Don stated that his grandfather was severely abusive, and it is probably speculated that the abuse might have been more than just physical. So Don, basically with his own words, said he was glad that his grandfather was dead. So after the funeral, Don goes to the Kiefer home and sits around for a while. But at supper time, Don went up the stairs, which is where the bathroom was, to wash his hands and get ready for supper. Now, in the bathroom, something supernatural occurred. Don states that he felt the atmosphere change, like he felt a heaviness, like he was feeling some sort of pressure that could not be explained. So he instantly knew something was wrong. He stated that he was attacked, physically attacked by something he couldn't see. However, while the attack was going on, he looked out the little window that was in the bathroom and he saw a figure that he said looked like the devil. He stated that it felt cold and almost like he was in a vacuum, like there was not enough air for him to gather as he was trying to fight off this attack. So I would say at this point, it's pretty obvious that this is where Don became possessed. And let me explain to you why I say that. Many people who I've worked with who have claimed possession, and I would say maybe the big majority, but not everyone, but most people say that they know or they felt the possession occur. They felt the moment when something entered their body. I wish I could say it's 100% of the time, because there are people that state that they don't know when it happened, but most people do. And as Don's description is being laid out by himself here in the story, you can see that this is a pretty obvious attack where things outside of the norm were occurring to him. If you feel like you're in a vacuum, you felt the room get cold, the atmosphere changed, and something's attacking you, including scratching him pretty heavily on his arm with 3 scratches. But then when you come down the stairs after washing your hands, when the family realizes that you're not back and they're screaming for you, and you come back and you feel different, I would say it's pretty obvious that that's when he became possessed. Now, Dawn at the time, and even to this day, believes that it was his grandfather, which I don't believe. I actually believe that it was the demon that was attached to his grandfather that was probably influencing the abuse, uh, than came for Dawn at that time. So we would call this a familiar spirit. Some people say familial spirits, which a familiar spirit can also be familial, which means they're around. They are tormenting a family, studying a family. They have a scheme to destroy an entire family. And so, in my opinion, the demon that was attached to the grandfather, when he died, left the body, of course, and was looking for somebody else to attach to. And why not the grandson, who obviously was in a state of turmoil, being incarcerated, so on and so forth. He seemed to be a good target. So, like I said, when Don came down, he had 3 scratches on his arm that he tried to cover up. So he didn't tell the family right away what happened. But because he looked so disheveled and like something was wrong, Bob noticed the scratches on his arm. And Bob also said that Don had a strange look on his face. And so basically he pressed Don, like, what's going on here, man? Like, are you okay? Where did these scratches come from? You look like something's wrong. And this is when Don told them what happened. Now, if you watch retellings of this story, so for example, I got a lot of this material from the show Paranormal Witness, where they do a pretty decent reenactment and a good job of interviews. Um, you can imagine, as Don is explaining these things, it's probably hard to believe. You're probably doubting or questioning, his sanity, or maybe his truthfulness, and you're probably wondering, did this guy get out of prison? Was he upstairs doing something he wasn't supposed to? But it doesn't seem through the storytelling that it took the family very long to start to believe him, because the family stated that they noticed that the house was cold, and to put it in their words, something was just off. Um, so basically, at this point, the family is eating, but they're disturbed, if you will. And then this is where the story takes this astronomically astonishing event. When something like this happens, I can imagine, and I've seen some very supernatural things. I have never seen this, and this might be something that even goes beyond stuff that I've seen by a long shot. The family noticed that water starts running down the wall, which is not the astonishing part. But as they kind of start to study the water running down the wall, Bob actually notices there is no pipes. There's no water on that side of the home. So if there is a leak, the water would have to be running from the other side of the home all the way down the floor, and then dripping down the walls into the room that they were in downstairs. But as Bob and his family begin to touch the water, it feels sticky. So it's not water per se. There's something different to this substance. And so they're pretty astonished that this is happening, but it's obvious that, to them that it's probably some sort of leak. But before they can go to investigate, this is where things turn crazy. It began to rain in the living room. So I always try to tell my listeners, and even as a preacher and as teaching, I always try to tell people to make visual pictures in your head, make a movie in your head, because it'll help you understand just how paranormal or preternatural that this is. So imagine you see water dripping down the wall, but then you now see it raining in the house. So you would look up at the ceiling, but you're trying to gather, are there drops of water on the ceiling that are falling? But the family noticed that the rain kind of seemed to come from nowhere, and yet it would fall. So Bob Kiefer is in a state of shock, but he had the wherewithal to say, I got to call the landlord because he needs to know what's going on. He needs to get here immediately. So he does call the landlord, a man named Ron Von Wy, and he came over basically right away with his wife Romaine. They're the owners of the home, because although Bob didn't tell him what was going on, he told him, "You got to get here. Just trust me." And so when Ron got there and his wife Romaine got there, it was still raining in the house. And at this point, you're trying to grasp for straws. And so Ron, of course, being the owner of the house, wanted to go upstairs to look for leaks. And as they went upstairs, they said they could feel something evil was in the house. They could feel it up there. It was, tangible to them, although they couldn't see it. And so they checked for leaks on the side of the house where there was water, and there was none. They considered that maybe rain was stored up somewhere maybe in the attic, and then it had made its way down, but it hadn't rained for days and days and days. So this made no sense. In the meantime, the ladies are downstairs with Dawn, and he's just sitting on the couch in a trance, just staring forward, eyes open, basically in like a state of suspended animation. And as Ron and Bob make their way back downstairs, they're sitting there contemplating what to do. And this is where there was no longer any doubt that something paranormal was occurring, because as they were contemplating what to do, the raindrops began to come from the floor and rain upwards. So, again, in your mental picture, in your mental movie, imagine as you're trying to figure out what is going on in this home, you see water come from the floor and go up. That defies physics. It defies all logic. There is zero way that you can explain that. And I've actually seen people try to explain it, try to, call on magic and this type of thing. But you have several witnesses, an entire family, a husband and wife and children, as well as the landlord and his wife, that are watching it rain upwards. So at this time, with basically no idea of what to do, Bob decided to call the cops. Now, again, this town isn't very big, so it's one of those places where everybody kind of knows everybody. So Bob called the cops, and an officer actually answered, and it was an officer by the name of John Bojan. And because he knew Bob Kiefer, when Bob tried to explain to him that he can't really tell him what's going on, but you need to come over. Although John was annoyed, he came over. In a larger city, you wouldn't have been able to get the police to come without an explanation. But in this little town, John could hear it in Bob's voice that this was something that he truly needed help with. So this is where I challenge you to really put it in your head as to the credibility of the witnesses in this story. Because John Bojan, although at the time was just an officer, later went on to become the chief of police in this town. So he could not be somebody who was just a run of the mill police officer that was, irrational or, not responsible and credible. He later became the chief of police in this town. And so when John and his partner arrived, they actually witnessed the phenomenon. This rain had been going on for, a long time. And when they saw the rain manifest, it was a conversation as to, are there leaks? Did you check? But it didn't take them long to realize themselves that this was paranormal, because if raining upwards isn't crazy enough, Officer Bojan actually stated that they saw a raindrop appear in front of them to the one side of their vision and then go sideways across their vision and down a hall into a dark kitchen. So, again, in your mental picture, you watch a raindrop manifest and then just take off down the hall right in front of your eyes. So, Officer Bojan, of course, um, stated, you're going to have to probably call somebody else. There's nothing that the police can do. And they basically left. Um, it doesn't go on to say that if they documented the calls or not, because as a police officer, I'm not sure exactly what I would have done with that. But if I reported it, it would have been very minimum, and I might have, referenced a potential leak. But I don't think I would have actually written in there that I saw rain manifest and rain sideways and upwards. So as the cops left, it's apparent to me in the story that, at some point tensions got a flare, and this is where the ladies actually became angry at Don. And they started talking about him first, and then they eventually lost their cool and pulled him aside and started to yell at him. So Don is getting the riot act read to him, and suddenly the house begins to shake. Pots and pans begin to clatter, and Don was then lifted off the ground like he was being choked. So, although they could not see any hands, it was as if something large had grabbed him by the neck and lifted him off the ground. And it held him there for a little while and then threw him backwards about 5 to 6 feet. Now, Don began to writhe in pain. And this is when they noticed that more scratches had been inflicted on his arms, including one that looked like a crown. At this point, the family has no doubt that there's something paranormal here, and all of them agree that it's a demonic force at work. There's no doubt that it's evil, because they can feel the evil, but they've also seen the attack on Dawn. And so Bob's wife actually grabbed the Bible and started reading Psalm 23 over and over. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And she just kept reciting it over and over. At this point, Officer Bojan had been riding around and decided he felt bad for just leaving the family. And although there was nothing he can do, he thought he would just go back and check on him. So as he walks in the house, he sees Bob's wife reading the Bible over and over, and he's watching as the raindrops have now all focused on Bob's wife. So instead of it raining in the entire living room area, it is only raining on Bob's wife's head and around her body as she's reading the Bible. And so we're not clear on how long Officer Bojan stayed, but eventually it turned into morning. So this thing went on all night long. So if they were eating supper when this started, you can imagine that's hours and hours and hours of this thing happening in the house. But when morning came, the rain stopped. And, at this time, it's time for Don to go back to the jail. And so he's basically sent packing. And Don actually said that, he never even saw the Kiefer family again. And, Bob, as you hear his interview, he really felt that Don was a good kid and that something had just bad had just happened to him. But, something like this would make it to where you're probably not welcome at a family's home again. So Don stated he never saw the keepers again. Um, Unfortunately, Don knew at that time that the entity was still inside of him. So when Don went back to the jail, um, this information had been relayed to them, and so a lot of the offers in the jail, or a lot of the officers in the jail, claimed that they felt the evil when he came in. And of course, you can say, well, that's because they had heard the stories, but they still felt it. And basically, at this point, Don stated that he could control the rain now. So it wasn't just something that was a random thing for him anymore. He actually could control it. And his cellmate, he couldn't keep a cellmate basically, but when his cellmates would notice that the rain was going horizontal and climbing the walls, they wanted out of there. So the warden eventually had to house him alone, and not necessarily for safety, but just for the potential danger of what would happen next if this wasn't just rain. Because Don at this time was already a different person. Everybody could notice that he was different. They could feel the evil around him. But of course, like anywhere else, there's always skeptics, right? So some of the guards didn't believe it and began to taunt him one day. And they basically said, well, make it rain. And not only that, make it rain on the warden. And Don said he simply said, okay. He sat there, concentrated, snapped his finger, and a raindrop went through several locked doors to a completely different part of the jail and hit the warden right in the chest. The warden, with his own words, so again, the credibility of a witness, with his own words, stated that a big raindrop hit him right in the chest and soaked his shirt. Now, again, as you factor in not only evidence but the credibility of the witnesses. So you have a warden, basically officers of the law who, I'm not saying that police can't be dishonest, but these are two separate officers in two separate jurisdictions that are still reporting that these things are happening, as well as several other guards. So at this point, the discussion around the jail and the warden's belief is that Don is possessed. And so they contacted the prison chaplain, and an exorcism was actually scheduled in the prison. So a gentleman named Reverend Blackburn, who was a priest, but he was the prison chaplain, and a lot of times chaplains have to work, not just out of their faith, but out of consideration of other faiths. But he was a priest, came to perform the exorcism in a secluded part of the jail, and this had to be done outside of the view of other inmates. So they put him in a secluded part of the jail, closed the door. The warden and some other officers waited outside, and the priest began the exorcism. Immediately, a foul odor appeared as the priest read from the Bible. Don's own account stated that the rain would hit the priest, but it would not hit the Bible. And so this exorcism went on and on and on, and um, the reverend who performed the exorcism and Don also believed that it was successful. And Don stated that this has never happened since. So I believe at this point that Don was actually delivered from this evil entity that had possessed him. Um, and so when you when you look at this and you see that Don's own words are basically that he believed he survived something that was trying to kill him, that this story, although extremely fantastical and hard to believe, was actually witnessed by maybe the most credible of witnesses on planet Earth. Not just one person or two people, but several people, several officers of the law that will come on a television show like Paranormal Witness or others and tell their story at risk of ridicule, um, questioning their integrity, their sanity, but they're willing to speak out on it because to them it's a fact. To them, it's worth them speaking out because they believe that what they saw was so incredible and needs to be known. And so I want to kind of give props, first of all, to the warden of this prison jail. It's kind of a weird um, entity there in this part of Pennsylvania because most of the time jail and prison are two different things, but in this case, it's kind of like a mutual type residence for inmates. But a warden to be willing to go outside of the box to help an inmate to schedule an exorcism may be virtually unheard of because most wardens are only interested in the judicial part of this and maybe even the tangible logical part of this. But on the same token, you have to also look at this and say, this was such a odd occurrence and so disturbing to the jail that the warden had no choice but to do something outside of the box, which I think could also be true. And therefore, they did what they had to do. But give him props for scheduling this. And the priest, you know, those of us who are not Catholic oftentimes get pinned against priest in terms of what's called deliverance ministry versus what the Catholics call exorcism. And sometimes those terms are interchangeable and maybe sometimes they're not. But I've seen a lot of stories and I've actually met a lot of priests who have attempted exorcism, and there's a specific ritual that is done within the Catholic Church that sometimes doesn't appear to work. And sometimes the Catholics will also criticize the Protestants because it's more of a, I want to say, like a looser ritual. It's not ritualistic, basically. So it looks so different that sometimes priests and Protestants, in terms of deliverance ministry, get pinned against each other. But I think this priest understood that the deliverance doesn't come from a ritual, but it actually comes through Jesus and through his faith and through Don's willingness to get rid of this. They were able to exorcise these demons, this at least one demon, there's usually more. We don't hear that in the telling of the story. So, um, in a lot of these bonus episodes, I have taken the time to break down, what should have been done. But in this episode, I actually have to say that I believe the opposite is true. What should have been done in this case was done. That instead of trying to bring in a paranormal team or instead of trying to find more evidence, which again, I'm not bashing paranormal teams, that has a place and a time. But in this case, I don't think evidence was needed. I think deliverance was needed. And so the warden was able to find a chaplain who was willing to take this on. Now, I don't know a lot about Reverend Blackburn. He may have been someone who had experience in this before and maybe not. But I do believe that he was the right guy for the job at the right time. And so Don Decker, as far as we know now, went on to live a great life. No more possessions, no more rain, no more feeling that he um, had something inside of him and that there's a happiness to him. Now, I do have to say that there is one part of Don's story as he tells it that is somewhat concerning for me, in the sense of Don's, keeping these things at bay. And it's Don's belief that his grandfather was the one that was attacking him. Now, why is this important? And maybe to some of you it won't be, but I don't believe that that's how this works. Now, I believe that the spirit was able to convince him somehow to run with that theory because maybe it's easier for Don to believe that than an actual demon had possessed him. But Don had also associated the evil with his grandfather. And therefore, if anybody on earth was going to come back and attack him, it would have been his grandfather because maybe he was afraid that he would tell his grandfather secrets, that type of thing. But, there is a concern of mine because if Don continues to believe that, he doesn't fully grasp that the demon that was possessing his grandfather was probably the demon that attacked him. Now, it could be another demon, and Don's life didn't appear to be in good shape at the time. And so there could be demons that were attached to Don already, and then other demons that were all working in conjunction and timed this thing just right to hit him at the right time. But I do not believe that it was the disembodied spirit of his grandfather. And we have discussed that a lot in previous episodes, and I would encourage you to go back and listen to some of those episodes on the beliefs on whether or not there are actually ghosts or if those are just demons representing themselves to be the disembodied spirit of a person in order to get you to drop your guard. Now, as I often say, there's a lot of theology and debate and conversations that can happen about something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and leave those on the shelf for now because it's not really relevant at this point. What's relevant is that Don was willing to accept faith as an alternative to the demon or demons that were attached to him. And as we continue on in this podcast throughout future episodes, you will continually hear me say that if you're not willing to accept Jesus into your life, if you're not willing to accept that this spiritual warfare is bigger than you, that the players are more powerful than you, and that fighting this thing on your own free will is impossible. It has to be something where you surrender this battle to the person that's already won it. And I want to give you a visual for that. So let's say, for example, there's a bully in your town. Let's say at your school, and he beats up everybody. Every day he takes out 5 or 6 different kids and takes their lunch money. Okay. Now, if you are somebody who every third or fourth day, receives this bullying, and you feel that this person is so big and so strong and so undefeatable that you just surrender to it. But then you have this new kid that comes along and he's your size, and he is somebody who just doesn't have the fear because he doesn't know the myth of this bully. So when this bully comes into his life, this young man's life, he doesn't submit to it, and even without physicality is able to, with his words, disarm the bully, and the bully goes away and doesn't have any more power. Why would you come to school the next day still afraid of the bully, right? Doesn't really make sense. And in that very simplistic little example, some of us, because we still haven't fully grasped that this bully, these demons, have been defeated. The devil is the prince of the demons, and he is a defeated foe. These demons are already defeated on Calvary. So they wiggle their way into our lives based on lies and based on our acceptance of those lies and the consequent opening of doors that allow the demons to come in when they've already been defeated. And when you can grasp that your God, if you choose to accept him, Jesus Christ, has defeated this enemy, and this Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit can come and live inside of you, then any lie that you are told can be diffused by remembering the truth. Remember, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. When you have that in your life, these demons have to flee. But we live in this constant battle of our flesh and sin and the demonic influences that take our focus off of God's finished work on the cross. And so when you accept that finished work and you live according to it and you make Jesus the Lord of your life and you get better at that every day. We're not perfect. We will continue to fall, but when we keep our eyes focused on him, these demons lose their steam. They lose their power. They're no longer the big, mean, evil bullies of our nightmares and horror movies, but they become a defeated foe that you can turn to Jesus when they try to manifest in your life. You could turn to Jesus and they become less of a threat to you. They're always going to attack. They're always wanting to get in. They're always wanting to destroy you. But when you understand that this war has already been won, you don't fight it. You let the war be fought by Jesus because he's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we're his children if you choose to accept that. We earn the right to become the sons and daughters of God. And when you choose that, then this evil foe becomes a defeated foe in your mind. And therefore, you just have that freedom, that deliverance from this battle. And it becomes an easier fight to fight now that you know this. You know, if you think of putting on the armor of God, and as you break that down in Ephesians, you can understand what that armor truly is. It's just an understanding that you're putting on those finished works. You're putting on this armor that was provided for you by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, as we conclude this episode, let me just kind of reiterate that not every possession story has raindrops falling upwards and sideways. Most of the time, these stories just include a methodical deconstruction of a human being. For some reason, this story evolved into this, crazy visual and this crazy paranormal story that maybe God allowed just so we can hear the story of the deliverance of Don Decker. But most of us won't see this. So for those of you listening who are still trying to grasp this spiritual warfare, don't wait until raindrops are falling upside down before you called for help. If you feel you're oppressed, if you feel you're being attacked, reach out as soon as possible. And you can always reach out to us at anthony@thestruggleseries.com, and myself or my team will get you to somebody in your area, or at least try to give you some resources on who you can seek out to help you with this type of deliverance. And there are some great pastors, one pastor in particular, and I haven't got his permission to speak on this, but I will eventually. He actually has a map where you can go and find deliverance ministers in your area. And I think it's worldwide. So there are resources out there that we can help you obtain. So I want to thank you very, very much for tuning in to this bonus episode of the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Remember, for those of you patrons, we're trying to do these bonus episodes 2 times a month. And so just keep your ears out for the next one. But for now, I just want to wish you many blessings and may God bring you peace. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.